The strangest thing about that afternoon was how ordinary it began. The sun was still high, the streets were warm, and children were riding bicycles along the sidewalks when I saw my neighbor standing alone beside her mailbox, holding an envelope that seemed to have taken all the strength out of her. She looked at me, forced a smile, and quickly wiped her eyes before I could ask what was wrong. I had lived next door to Marlowe for almost a year, yet I had never seen her look that broken. I knew she lived alone, knew she rarely had visitors, and knew she always seemed to be carrying some invisible weight, but that afternoon I finally understood that sometimes the person smiling at you from across the fence is quietly fighting a battle you know nothing about. If you believe that kindness can give someone a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Legacy. You never know when a simple story might remind someone that they are not alone. My name is Everett, and at the time I was 34 years old, recently divorced, and living in a small rented house that still felt too quiet even after I had spent months trying to get used to it. I worked from home repairing old photographs and restoring damaged family pictures, which meant I spent most of my days staring at faces from other people's pasts. Ironically, I was terrible at dealing with my own. My divorce had left me cautious, withdrawn, and convinced that caring too deeply about anyone was simply another way of giving life the opportunity to hurt me. Marlowe was different. She never asked personal questions, never pushed into my private life, and never treated my loneliness like something embarrassing. Sometimes she would leave a basket of homemade bread at my door. Sometimes I would mow the narrow strip of grass between our houses while she pretended not to notice. We had become neighbors in the quietest way possible, through small acts that neither of us ever mentioned. That afternoon, however, I couldn't pretend not to notice. When I crossed the driveway and asked if everything was all right, Marlowe looked down at the envelope in her hand. It was a letter from a hospital. Her mother, who had been battling a long illness several states away, had taken a serious turn. Marlowe had been planning to visit her, but she had just lost her job after the small bookstore where she worked closed unexpectedly. She had barely enough money to cover rent and groceries, and the thought of buying a last-minute ticket home had become impossible. What hurt her most wasn't the money. It was the fear that her mother might need her and she wouldn't be there. I didn't know what to say, so I did the only thing that felt useful. I offered her a ride to the bus station the next morning and quietly told her I would help with the rest. She immediately refused. Pride flashed across her face, the kind of pride people develop after life has taught them that accepting help can sometimes come with a price. I told her there was no price. I reminded her that neighbors were supposed to help each other. She stared at me for several seconds, then laughed through her tears and said that perhaps I was right. The next day, instead of taking her directly to the bus station, I surprised her with another idea. A local theater was hosting an old-fashioned daytime drive-in movie event at an outdoor park, complete with classic cars, giant speakers, popcorn, and a huge screen set up beneath the open sky. Marlowe looked at me as if I had lost my mind. She had a bus to catch later that evening, her mother was sick, and I was suggesting a movie. But I told her she deserved 2 hours in which nobody expected anything from her. She deserved to breathe before stepping back into the storm. She finally agreed. We arrived just after noon, with sunlight spilling across the parking field and clouds moving slowly across the blue sky. My old car was hardly impressive, but the back seat was clean, and I had filled the trunk with blankets, snacks, and 2 cups of iced coffee. For the first time in days, Marlowe smiled without forcing it. She sat beside me while the opening credits appeared on the giant screen, and for a while we simply watched. Then something unexpected happened. Marlowe began laughing. Not politely. Not quietly. She laughed so hard she covered her face with both hands, and I found myself laughing too. We forgot about hospital rooms, overdue bills, broken marriages, empty houses, and everything else that had been weighing on us. The movie wasn't even particularly good, but somehow it didn't matter. For a little while, we were just 2 people sitting beneath the afternoon sun, sharing popcorn and remembering what it felt like to enjoy being alive. Halfway through the film, Marlowe became quiet. I looked over and saw tears running down her cheeks. I thought she was thinking about her mother, so I reached for the tissues. She shook her head and smiled. Then she opened the car door, stepped out, walked around to the other side, and climbed into the back seat. I turned around, completely confused. She pulled one of the blankets around herself and looked at me with a nervous smile before softly saying that the movie could wait. Those words stayed with me because I realized she wasn't asking for romance. She was asking for a moment of safety. She wanted to sit somewhere the world couldn't reach her for a few minutes. So I turned off the movie sound, climbed into the back seat beside her, and simply listened. She told me about her mother. She told me about the last Christmas they had spent together, the arguments they had regretted, and the promises they had made to call each other more often. She confessed that she had spent years believing she had disappointed her mother because she hadn't become the successful daughter everyone expected. Then she told me something that broke my heart. Her mother had recently left her a voicemail saying that she didn't care about careers, money, or accomplishments. She only wanted her daughter home. Marlowe had been too afraid to listen to the voicemail again. I asked her to play it. Her hands trembled as she pressed the button. The recording was short. Her mother's voice was weak, but full of warmth. She said she wasn't calling to make Marlowe feel guilty. She simply wanted her to know that she had always been proud of her. When the message ended, Marlowe buried her face in her hands and cried. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't tell her everything would be fine. Sometimes those words are meaningless when someone is terrified of losing the person they love. I just sat beside her and let her cry. After several minutes, she looked at me and admitted something else. She said she had been afraid of getting close to anyone since her fiancé had left her 2 years earlier, taking their savings and leaving behind a mountain of debt. She had promised herself she would never depend on another person again. Then she looked at me and said that somehow, without either of us realizing it, I had become the first person she trusted. I felt my chest tighten. I had been afraid too. My marriage had ended because I had spent years emotionally hiding behind work, believing that providing a stable life was the same as being emotionally present. After my divorce, I had convinced myself that solitude was peace. But sitting beside Marlowe, listening to her fears, I realized solitude wasn't always peace. Sometimes it was simply loneliness with better furniture. We drove to the bus station before sunset. This time, Marlowe didn't hesitate when I offered to help with her ticket. She accepted, but before getting out of the car, she reached into her bag and handed me a small folded piece of paper. She told me not to read it until she was gone. I watched her disappear through the station doors. Then I unfolded the paper. It contained only one sentence: "Thank you for reminding me that being cared for doesn't make me weak." I kept that note. Marlowe left that evening and spent several weeks with her mother. During those weeks, we talked almost every day. Sometimes we spoke for an hour. Sometimes it was only a message telling me that her mother had eaten breakfast or that she had finally slept through the night. I never asked what would happen between us. I didn't want kindness to become a transaction. I wanted her to know that she could return home without owing me anything. Then, one bright morning, I heard a knock at my door. Marlowe was standing there. She looked exhausted but peaceful. Her mother had survived the crisis. The doctors had adjusted her treatment, and although there were still difficult days ahead, they had been given more time together. Marlowe smiled and told me she had something to ask. She wanted to know if I would take her to another movie. I laughed and asked whether she wanted the front seat this time. She shook her head. She said she wanted the back seat. We drove to the same outdoor theater that afternoon. The screen was enormous, the sky was clear, and the parking field was almost empty. We sat in the back of my old car beneath the same kind of blanket. But this time neither of us was running from sadness. We were simply choosing to be there together. The movie began, but neither of us watched much of it. We talked about ordinary things. Future plans. Places we wanted to visit. Meals we wanted to cook. The kind of home we hoped to build someday. And somewhere between those simple conversations, I realized that love doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as a cup of coffee, a ride to the bus station, a basket of bread, or a person sitting beside you when you don't have the strength to stop crying. Months later, Marlowe moved into a small apartment closer to her mother, but she never truly left my life. Every few weeks, she would return for a visit. Eventually, the little apartment between our houses became ours, and the two lonely people who had once been afraid of depending on anyone slowly learned how to depend on each other without losing themselves. Years later, whenever someone asked how our relationship began, Marlowe would smile and tell them about the day I took her to a drive-in movie. She would laugh and say that she climbed into the back seat and told me the movie could wait. But the truth was, the movie was never the important part. The important part was that two broken people finally stopped pretending they weren't hurting. One offered kindness. The other accepted it. And somewhere between the tears, the laughter, and the afternoon sunlight, they discovered that second chances don't always come from grand miracles. Sometimes they come from ordinary people who simply choose not to walk away. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who may need a little hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Legacy. Your support helps these stories reach people who might be quietly fighting battles of their own. And I have one special request before we end. In the comments, write kindness can change a life if you believe one small act of compassion can give someone the courage to begin again. Because sometimes, the person sitting quietly next door isn't waiting for someone to save them. They're simply waiting for someone to remind them that they still matter.